Welcome, everyone. What a great crowd. Thank you so much for coming. I'm Lisa Pullman, the Executive Director of the Natural Resources Council of Maine. First, I'd like to thank the University of Southern Maine for hosting us tonight and introduce the president of USM, Glenn Cummings, because he would like to welcome you too. Glenn?
Thank you, Lisa. We're delighted and very proud to be hosting the event tonight. We care deeply about this issue of sustainability. Sometimes we will have higher education will be challenged, and somebody will say, why are you so into the issue of sustainability? You're only 1% of the nation's landmass. And the response is, we are 100% of the nation's future leadership. We are delighted to be part of the Natural Resources Council, the World Affairs Council, and the American Security Project, and we're delighted that it is being done here on our campus. We aspire and we attain a position of creating great dialogue in Maine and beyond, and today we are honored to host you all. We are also delighted to recognize Senator King. Senator King is so good at improving the environment that every time he walks into the U.S. Senate, the environment improves a lot. So we thank you tonight. We are honored to have a packed audience. It shows the deep support and the interest in this ultimately crucial issue. Have a terrific night. Thank you.
Well, I wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't start with a few words about NRCM. We are the leading environmental advocacy organization in Maine, and we have been at it for almost 60 years now, trying to protect Maine's waters, woods, and wildlife. We work on nearly every major environmental policy facing Maine, including the promotion of clean energy and action to address climate change. If you are following today's proceedings in Augusta, we are so disappointed that once again the governor has twisted enough arms to kill the solar bill. However, this is a shame and we will not give up, and you shouldn't either. NRCM is a membership organization, and I know that there are lots of members in the audience. Thank you. We could not do what we do without you. Now, on the issue of the evening, we all recognize that climate change poses significant risks to Maine and our nation. Climate change is largely due to the emission of fossil fuels. We know that sea levels are rising, the ocean is becoming more acidic, glaciers around the world are retreating, and weather events are becoming more intense. Here in Maine, we already see changes that over time will affect our economy, the health of Maine people, and our way of life. These are big concerns that deserve urgent attention and action. Tonight's program is focused on the even larger context of how climate change is affecting U.S. national security and global stability. NRCM is pleased to be co-sponsoring this program with the American Security Project and the World Affairs Council of Maine. And we are grateful to our panelists, who I would like to quickly introduce. Senator Angus King, who needs almost no introduction, was elected to the U.S. Senate in 2012 as Maine's first independent governor. He serves on the Senate Armed Services Committee, Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, and Committee on Energy and Natural Resources, all of which are relevant for tonight's discussion. Senator King served 2 terms as Maine's governor, and he has been a champion in support of clean energy and action to address the risks of climate change. We really can count on him. He will help moderate the discussion with the other 2 panelists. Lieutenant General John Castellaw, U.S. Marine Corps, retired. He has served 36 years in the Marines, flying more than 24 different aircraft. He served as Chief of Staff for the U.S. Central Command at the height of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars. He has received multiple military decorations, including selection as the 1990 Marine Aviator of the Year. He serves as a defense consultant, and he has played a significant role since retiring from the Marines to help veterans find agricultural jobs. And maybe he'll tell us a little story about his farm outside of Memphis. And then we have Roger Sorkin. Roger is an award-winning producer, writer, and director who specializes in topics involving the environment, energy, and national security. He serves as the executive director and producer for the American Resilience Project, and he produced the film Tidewater, which documents the vulnerability to sea level rise on military installations in Norfolk, Virginia. So we'll start with Roger, followed by General Castellaw, and then Senator King. Each will provide opening remarks and then engage in conversation around a set of questions, including some that I will come back up to the podium and prompt them with. So thanks again for being here tonight, and I'll turn it over to Roger.
Thank you very much. Thank you to everybody for being here tonight. So my name is Roger Sorkin. I am the Executive Director of the American Resilience Project, and we create films, and the way we like to see it is that we harness the power of storytelling to influence policy and behavioral change in the area of resilience, mostly environmental resilience. And we try to really depoliticize these issues, and we try to do that through story and create what we call as a strategic narrative, with the understanding that it's something that everybody can get behind. I mean, if you think about our military being concerned about saving blood and treasure whenever possible, I don't think that there's anyone on any side of the ideological spectrum that can be against that. So we start with what are the things that unite us, what are the ways that we can talk about things that don't push people away. And I think I'll assume that you're all here tonight because you care about climate change and you're concerned about the effects of climate change. The problem that we have is that there are a lot of people in the country that don't care about it or that are skeptical about it. And my hope is that after you leave here tonight, you can go out there and know how to talk about it in a way that does attract people to you and not push people away. And you know, people ask me, well, how do you do that? And I will tell you how not to do it. It's to don't tell them that Al Gore told you about polar bears, because we know that doesn't work. And so remember that the messenger really matters. The credibility of that messenger really matters. And so what you're about to see is I have a short clip from the film Tidewater that we made about the Hampton Roads region. Norfolk is one of the municipalities in Hampton Roads. It is our largest concentration of military bases in the country. We have 14 large installations there. There are 17 jurisdictions that are trying to work together to address the problem on the bases and in the communities, because there's an interdependency there. The bases need the communities for their electricity, their water supply, their sewage, the roads that people drive on. And if they can't all figure it out together, then nobody's going to have a solution. So we can cue up that video. I think we've got that ready. What you're going to see is a little bit of the trailer to start, and then we'll segue into a couple of minutes worth of excerpts from the film.
Flooding is happening on sunny days. Constant environmental challenges degrade readiness over time.
The commanding officer has to turn off the electrical power to the piers.
It cancels church, it cancels softball games.
You know, stresses add up over time, especially in a military life. It's stressful enough.
The U.S. military, they see the problem. The naysayers are jeopardizing U.S. national security, and they are jeopardizing the U.S. economy.
Facts are that the water's coming up and the land's going down.
Water is the water, and it doesn't matter what your politics are, it still comes in my yard, in my basement.
With over 80 ships and 30 plus squadrons and 10 plus submarines, it's our largest naval base, naval concentration area, if you would, in the world, is right there in the greater Hampton Roads area. And we're not going anywhere. We, along with the community, have to figure out how we're going to address this challenge.
The Hampton Roads region has been in use by military and merchant mariners since pre-Revolutionary War times. There's always been a presence here because of its proximity to the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay. The region is 17 cities and municipalities that stretch from the peninsula, Williamsburg, south to the far eastern corner of Tidewater, Virginia. There are federal facilities scattered throughout the 17 cities and municipalities. A substantial number of them are military, so there are things here that can't go anywhere else.
The Navy family, most of it lives in those communities. So, whether they own a house, whether they rent a house, that sailor is also a Sunday school teacher, that sailor is also a Little League coach. We count on the community. The community provides us the utilities, electrical power, water, sewage, the transportation infrastructure that we need. Pretty difficult to get the people onto the base if they're driving down roads that have standing water on them.
If this region can figure out a way to collaboratively set standards and plan towards those standards and adapt, then not only can they share with other regions how they do it, but they can share with regions around the world, really, how to take a very complex set of entities that all have to fit together in a puzzle and move forward together collectively. That's a real opportunity for this region, but not if it waits to get started.
We have the technology, we have the knowledge to protect what is critically important to our country. The cost of doing nothing is much greater than the cost of doing something.
So one thing I'll leave you with is a call to action. And you'll notice the words climate change didn't come up in that clip, and you won't find them anywhere in the film. There's no need to talk about climate change, which we recognize as a polarizing issue, when we know there's water here that didn't used to be here, so what do we do about it? I think if we can keep the conversation in terms of, we have a problem right here, right now. It's an environmental problem. Not all problems that are created by climate change, or not all environmental problems are created by climate change. So you have that as a good entry point into conversations with people that might not otherwise be receptive to a conversation on climate change. And I would encourage you actually to upend the conventional wisdom that you're not supposed to talk politics at family dinner. I think that's a great time to talk about it. You just have to know where you're meeting the person across the table from you and know what they care about, and make sure you put it in terms that they can relate to. So thank you very much, and General Castellaw.
Again, it's a great honor to be here. In this room tonight is more than the entire population of Crockett Mills, Tennessee, which we left a couple of days ago. It's really something to see this number of people in one place. Also, I think it's very fortunate that we have Senator King here tonight. I did 3 tours in the Pentagon, and that's sort of like saying you did 3 tours at Yuma Territorial Prison. But I learned a few things there. And one of the things was observing some of his Senate predecessors. There were 2 in particular that I admire tremendously. Senator Inouye from Hawaii, a progressive Democrat, and Senator Stevens from Alaska, a conservative Republican. They differed on many things, but they differed very collegially. But they combined together on the very critical element of our national security. And they worked together, and they did a tremendous job, in my view, of providing consistency to how we ensured that we as a nation would be safe. And to me, they are examples that all of us, whether we serve in Congress, in the Senate, and House of Representatives, at the state level, or as citizens here in this room, that we find those things that we agree on, we disagree collegially, and we work to make things better. I think that tonight what I'd like to do is sort of address two of the climate change issues and challenges. The first one is operational. And, I can't do very good quoting statistics and everything, but, I'm a good old Tennessee boy and I like to tell stories. And let me tell a story about a place in Africa called the Lake Chad Basin. I had the opportunity when I was an action officer at the U.S. European Command in the early 90s to go down to Chad, to N'Djamena, in preparation for a potential evacuation of Americans as a result of a potential coup. And it gave me the opportunity to go out into the countryside, fly over Lake Chad, see the economic structure of that country, which is mainly agrarian, based on fishermen in the Lake Chad and on herdsmen herding cattle in the areas of less water and a little grass, and then the farmers where they had enough water to grow crops. And then last year I went back and I flew over Lake Chad, and I saw how climate change had been one of the contributors to reducing the lake to 10% of its size from the 60s. And in so doing, 150,000 fishermen were scrapping to try to feed their family. Herdsmen were trying to find grass to feed their cattle, and farmers were trying to find enough water to grow their crops. And in doing so, they were competing with each other, and it was getting to where they were actually fighting each other, killing each other over the ever-decreasing resources caused by the impact of the advance of the Sahara Desert into that area by a mile every year. And what it did was it created instability. It generated uncertainty within the population of the ability of the government to provide services. And it created chaos that allowed an organization called Boko Haram to establish itself, to take hostages, to charge people for basic necessities, and then other times to take what they wanted while they grew their extremism and their insurgency. It was an incubator, and it still is, for those who want to express extreme views and are willing to use the utmost violence to do it. Why should we care? How does that impact our national security? Well, the Lake Chad Basin is composed of Nigeria, Niger, Cameroon, and Chad. Chad has been one of our staunchest allies in the war against terrorism. It's provided troops so that we wouldn't have to put our most precious national treasure, which is the blood of those men and women who serve in the military. Nigeria, the largest population in Africa, with energy resources and a lot of other resources that are important on the world scene. Cameroon, which is another important country, and Niger occupying a strategic position. Countries, if they became unstabilized, if they were taken into chaos, if they no longer provided a bulwark that in effect was one of the buffers for our own security, then we would have to eventually intervene with military forces. That is the impact, one of the examples of the impact climate change has on our national security. Another example is a lot closer to home, and I understand there was a civil war of sorts between New Hampshire and Maine over the Portsmouth Naval Shipyard. Unfortunately, I don't think there were many casualties, and that's good. But I was on a study not long ago that looked at what the impact of sea level rise would be on the Portsmouth Naval Shipyard. About 2050, instead of the dozen or less tidal incursions that occur now yearly, it could reach 180. And that would impact the crane tracks, it would impact the dockyards, the dry dock, it would impact many of the facilities that are used to refurbish and modernize one of the premier assets in our national arsenal, which is the U.S. Nuclear Submarine Force. Portsmouth is only one of 4 naval shipyards still in existence, and its mission is absolutely critical, and it must be maintained. By the end of the century, the forecast is that tidal activity during extreme tides will bisect the facility. It will cut off connections to the mainland. It will inundate the roads leading to it. It will put in flood condition many of the homes and businesses that support the shipyard. These are things that you Mainers can and will see unless we take appropriate action to reduce the impact of climate change. The U.S. military, we are agnostic. When we get battle space, what we do is what's called the intelligence preparation of the battle space. We identify what the terrain is, we look at what the threat is, we look at other factors that determine how we operate. One of the elements that we consider in the military, and it's not because we love polar bears or we're tree huggers, it's because our mission is to defend the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. And when we do our planning, we consider all those elements because it would be stupid not to do otherwise. That is what the impact of climate change is on our national security. It's a great honor to be here tonight, and I look forward to the questions. Thank you very much.
Those of you who know me know I very rarely read things, but I'm going to read something. I just want to be sure I get it exactly right. The impacts of the long-term trends toward a warming climate, more air pollution, biodiversity loss, and water scarcity are likely to fuel economic and social discontent and possibly upheaval through 2018. That's not Al Gore or Chuck Schumer or Nancy Pelosi or Lisa Pullman. That's Dan Coates, the Director of National Intelligence, former Republican senator from Indiana, appointed by President Trump. That was part of his worldwide threat assessment that he provided to the Intelligence and Armed Services Committee about 6 weeks ago. In 2014, the Pentagon does something called a quadrennial defense review, which is a study of all the threats, the resources, the situation that we have with regard to worldwide danger to our country. In 2014, the Quadrennial Review said the effects of climate change as, quote, threat multipliers that will aggravate stressors abroad, such as poverty, and this is just what the general was talking about, environmental degradation, political instability, and social tensions, conditions that can enable terrorist activity and other forms of violence. Throughout history, wars start over things like a lack of water, over things like famine. You can go back and look at any time in history, and that's often an underlying cause of why wars start. Now, I view this as a member of the Armed Services and Intelligence Committee from a kind of practical dollars and cents point of view. It's going to cost a fortune to shore up Hampton Roads. It's going to cost billions, if not trillions of dollars to shore up that huge area that is now very close to where the water is rising. And we multiply that by several thousand military facilities that we have around the country, and then add to that, the film could have, Roger and I were talking before, that film could have been made about Miami with the water. There's a new term I learned a few months ago, sunny day flood. A sunny day flood is literally what it sounds like. You have flooding when there's no storm, there aren't huge waves coming in, there's not a hurricane, it's just a high tide. And they're spending millions of dollars now in Miami raising their roads for sunny day floods. So just the dollars and cents cost in terms of protecting our infrastructure is really significant and impels us to try to figure out how we can mitigate, not just adapt to, that we got to adapt to it because it's already happening, but mitigate so that it doesn't get any worse. The second reason, and I think the more profound one, is what I referred to and what Dan Coates was talking about, and the Defense Department in their Quadrennial Review in 2014, and that is the effect of aggravating friction and conflict around the world leading to wars, leading to conflict, leading to instability. And that's where this really is a problem. Now, let me put this into perspective for you. The number of refugees from Syria is around 3 million. There are about 5 million total. 2 million are displaced within the country. 3 million have left the country. A great number of them are in neighboring countries. I've been to see the camps in Turkey and Jordan, but a fair number, and I don't know the exact number, call it 1.5 million, maybe 2 million, moved north into Europe. We don't have to do much but just look at the headlines of the last 2 or 3 years to realize what that movement of people, because of the war in Syria, but also in part because of climate, has done to the politics of Europe. Okay, I'll be generous, let's say it's 3 million. The estimate for the number of climate refugees in the next several decades, because of temperature rise and lack of water and famine and drought, is between 200 and 400 million. Compare that to the 3 million from Syria and what that did to the continent of Europe over the past 3 or 4 years. So think about the potential of what we're facing, and those people are mostly going to go north. Out of sub-Saharan Africa and through the Middle East, and they're going to go north. And we're turning ourselves inside out because of immigrants on our borders. This is going to be a major international challenge of the next, I would say, 30 to 40 years. And it is one of the most important reasons to me that this is a national security issue. Now, if I think I've got a slide back here I want to share with you. this slide taught me something that I didn't know before that makes this issue much more real and direct and frankly scary. About a year and a half ago, I went to Greenland with the Commandant of the Coast Guard and went out on the ice pack in Greenland and saw these things called moulins, which are huge holes the size of a football field in the ice pack, and rivers of meltwater are going down these holes to 2 miles down through the ice, lubricating underneath where the ice meets the rock and accelerating the flow of water out of the Greenland ice pack. Okay. Here's what I never realized. We all think of Casco Bay and the Atlantic Ocean, the Pacific Ocean, as fixed quantities. It's there every morning, it's the same, the tide goes up and down, but it's the same. It's always about where it's been. And interestingly, this chart is the last 24,000 years. Here's where we are. This is the last 8,000 years, and this is the sea level. And as you can see, it's pretty consistent. 8,000 years happens to be human history. In other words, human history going back to the pharaohs is about this period. Maybe this is a little bit longer. So it's not surprising that we should think of the level of the ocean as a fixed quantity. But if you go back 24,000 years, not millions of years, I always thought of the glaciers as millions. No, 24,000 years ago, right here where we're sitting, there was 2 miles of ice. And Casco Bay was 390 feet shallower than it is today. 390 feet. The Gulf of Maine was essentially a big lake. We all know of Georges Banks. There are petrified trees and mastodon teeth at the bottom on the ground in Georges Banks. Mastodon didn't swim all that well. They walked out there. And so this is what shocked me, was the dramatic change of 390 feet over the last 20, well, it leveled off, so at about the last 16,000 years. Now, here's the final piece I want to point out. This little part right here, very steep rise of sea level, called the Meltwater Pulse 1A. It happened at about 15,000 years ago. Here's what's scary about that. If you do the math on the rise and the time, it's about a foot a decade. That's what more and more climate scientists are starting to predict for the next 100 years. A foot a decade. That means 6 to 8 feet in the next 100 years. Now, I admit that's on the outside of the estimates, but every time I see an estimate of sea level rise, they change it upward. It's happening faster than people thought. And my favorite quote from Mark Twain is, "History doesn't always repeat itself, but it usually rhymes." And I'm worried that we're in a period of history now that may rhyme with the Meltwater Pulse 1A. And think of the implications. Let's assume that those estimates, 6 to 8 feet, are way off and cut them in half and call it 4 feet. That would be a disaster of major proportions. It would make virtually any city along the coasts of our country and any other country uninhabitable. And I don't know the percentage of people that live on the coasts in the world, but it's a high percentage. So we're talking about something, A, that's happened before, and B, all indications is happening again. There's about 20 feet of sea level rise in Greenland, and there's about 200 feet of sea level rise in Antarctica. If you think about it, Greenland and Antarctica are the last remnants of the glaciers. And the glaciers melting is what made this rise, plus warming temperature. So this is not an academic question, and I guess I'll end with a thought about politics. For the life of me, and I've been thinking about this issue a lot, I can't understand how this issue became a partisan issue. When I came of age in Maine politics in the 60s and 70s, the leaders of the environmental movement, the founders of the Natural Resources Council, were all Republicans. David and Sherry Huber, Hadi Hildreth, Joe Sewell, Ken McLeod, they were the people who wrote the initial laws, the coastal conveyance law, the subdivision law, the bottle bill. All of those laws came out of a bipartisan, mostly Republican consensus that this was important in protecting our environment. For some reason in the last 20 years, this has changed. And it's become this intensely divisive partisan issue that frankly I don't understand, because from my point of view, this is just data. And we don't debate whether light moves at 186,000 miles a second. And we don't debate that pi is 3.1416. This is simply science and data, and it's data that we have to take account of. So I welcome our guests here today and look forward to our discussion, and we'll get questions from you as well. But I think the reality and the reason I'm so happy to be here and thank our sponsors, because this is an issue that concerns everyone. And whether your concern is warming water and the movement of lobsters, the spread of Lyme disease further and further north, or national security, no matter which of those concerns are top on your list, the point is we have to do something about it, and we have to do it now. Thank you. I'm in my old Channel 10 mode now. I get to ask the questions. Roger, let me start with you. You did that film in Hampton Roads, and we'll start with the politics, and then we'll come back to some of the science. Hampton Roads happens to be one of the more conservative areas in the country. What did you perceive, and you said you tried to avoid the politics, but do people down there, are they in a different mindset because of the reality of what they're seeing?
I think so. I mean, the audience for this particular film isn't really the people of Hampton Roads, because the people of Hampton Roads, they experience this every day. So they know that something needs to be done about the water. What we didn't get into with them was, why is the water higher than it used to be? It doesn't really matter. When you are trying to figure out how are you going to get your city's ambulances to and from hospitals, or how are you going to deal with getting kids to and from school, or the examples are countless. I sort of like the military science approach to this, which is, and certainly General Castellaw can comment in greater detail about this, but when you see an enemy charging up the hill, you don't stop to think, well, how did that enemy get there? Let's debate the causes of that. First, you have to react and deal with it. And then if you don't want to have that enemy come back, then you have to start figuring out the root causes. So it's sort of that mindset. In this case, we address and acknowledge the fact that we have a problem. We got to do something about the problem. And then once you get everybody on the same page on that, and I would say that people in Hampton Roads are coming around to this, then you can start having that conversation about, now that we're dealing with adaptation and mitigation, how can we deal with the causes that could exacerbate this? And then you can start going to conversations about fossil fuel and transitioning to cleaner sources and reducing greenhouse gases. But it's still a pretty touchy subject for folks. And, certainly as the senator knows very well, politics has become, I would say, increasingly tribal. And what team you're on is probably the first question that people want to know before they ask you what you think about anything.
General, you've served in the Pentagon, you've served at a high-ranking position. Is there anything close to a consensus in the military about this issue, that this is something that needs to be dealt with and faced?
Again, we in the military, we're very anal. And we go through a set planning process. And part of that, again, is identifying the threats and what bears on accomplishing the mission. I think all of us in the military are professional, and what we take into consideration are those elements that bear on the case. And when we talk about what's going on in places like South Sudan, where we, of course, do contingency planning of all sorts for. You have to take into consideration the impact of climate change on there, on what's going on in that area. And that is how we proceed. It's agnostic, just like Roger talked about. It's not religious or ideological. It's what are the facts, and the most important thing is what I need to do to win, and all considerations are on the table. To do otherwise would be stupid. And it's your observation that these changes, whether they result in a drought or a famine or lack of water, the shrinking of the lake, lack of ability to make a living, lead almost inevitably to some level of conflict. They do. When we look around what's going on now, we've got 65 million people that have been displaced by conflict over the last few years. We have so many migrants that have been moving in areas, and a lot of that is as a result of a combination of conflict between tribes, conflict between religious organizations and communities, and also the impact of climate change on reducing those resources. And when that happens, then you have competitions for those resources that result in violence and displace the loser, and back and forth movements that produce this chaos and instability. I'm sure some of you are thinking, what about the lobsters? And I've got them on my tie here. These, by the way, are national security lobsters. You probably can't see them, but about every third one has a flag that he's carrying in one of his claws. No, but I just on that point, we're trying to focus particularly tonight on the national security implications, not all the broader ones. We could be here all night talking about all the other broad questions. Roger, when you were making that film, did you sense was it simply we have to adapt, or are people starting to ask questions about why is this happening?
Well, the folks that we talked to in Hampton Roads, they're just concerned about adaptation right now. Admittedly, I tried to steer the conversation away from climate change when it came up. I've set out to make this film in a way to essentially depoliticize the issue. So understanding that if you start telling people that this is a story about climate change, you've already drawn those lines. You've already divided people into camps. And so you've got a lot of people in Hampton Roads. It's sort of like the same reason why I think people look at mayors and see that mayors generally tend to be less ideological than their political counterparts in the U.S. House of Representatives or in the Senate or in a governor's mansion. Mayors have to deal with literally making trains run on time and fixing potholes and all of those day-to-day things that constituents want. They don't want to hear about some high-minded ideological principle that governs their political philosophy. They just want that pothole fixed. So the people in Hampton Roads, they want to get to work. They don't want to have, we up here, I live in Massachusetts, we have snow days. They have flood days down there now. They've canceled school during king tides when the high tides are at their highest point. So people are just very practical. They're just really assessing the situation that they encounter on a day-to-day basis.
But the only problem, that's important, but the problem is it doesn't deal with the causes. It's reactive, and we can fill a lot of sandbags, and we're talking about conflict. The best conflict is the one that doesn't happen. And that's where we get back to talking about what do we do? And of course, that's a pretty broad topic, but it seems to me it can't simply be, we give up, let's start building seawalls.
Well, quick point on that. I think there's a way to have that conversation in a less polarized manner. So, if we all know that changing the way we consume, acquire, and store energy is the root cause of the climate problems that we're having right now. So we also know that our military can be more effective if they have more resilient sources of energy, if they don't have to rely on transmission lines that go for many, many miles from a plant, and if a tree
Or
falls
tanker trucks full of gasoline.
and so if they can harvest their energy in place with a microgrid that's solar, and they have hybrids with wind and solar and diesel, but the idea is that they're moving to solar, then we sort of solve the energy problem without having to discuss climate change, and we show that it's economically feasible to do those microgrids instead of new gas plants.
General, isn't one of the major considerations for any military operation how to supply the energy necessary to get the tanks and the trucks and the people there?
Absolutely. I tell you where that really came down to me, Senator. I was standing on the Aditha Bridge, or dam in western Iraq on the Euphrates River, and it was sort of like looking at the picture on the Sunday school room back at Barker's Chapel Baptist Church. There was this river and the palm trees and all on each side of the river. And I watched as a Marine column of vehicles comes into the secure area. And as I'm watching, they turn a corner and one of the biggest explosions I've ever seen in my life goes off as they cook off an improvised explosive device, IED. 7 out of 10 of the convoys that operated in Afghanistan and Iraq were carrying water and gas. The majority of our casualties that we suffered in the fights, in the gunfights, was just resupplying our logistical forward basis. As a result of that, and again, we're agnostic. We're not tree huggers or polar bear aficionados. What we want to do is accomplish a mission. So we started creating portable wind generators. We started working on alternative fuel sources. We started backpack solar panels. We started looking at vehicles that didn't operate on as much fuel. The imperative in order to reduce the risk and increase the chances of being successful in accomplishing our mission dictated that we do those things. And if I may transgress a little bit more here, our economy is also the source of our national security. And we are doing things out there because it's the right thing to do to reduce our carbon footprint. In agriculture, we're doing what's called precision agriculture, which uses the Goldilocks principle of just the right amount of the right thing at the right place at the right time in order to reduce the amount of energy, fossil fuel, it takes to put the seed in the ground and to harvest them, the amount of herbicide that you have to spray in order to kill the weeds, and the amount of times that you have to traverse over those crops. And what that does is reduce the amount of energy that we use. It helps the environment from the reduction in energy to the reduction in runoff from nutrient overload, as well as excessive use of herbicide. So that also is one of the elements that contributes to our national security.
Roger, has your film shown around Hampton Roads or in other military communities? How's it going over?
Well, interestingly, we've had a lot of requests from military. It is shown at Naval Station Norfolk. It's shown on the public television station down in Hampton Roads, and initially they were going to run it opposite the Super Bowl, and I talked them out of it because we're really trying to reach a for lack of a better term, a center-right audience. Again, we're really trying to know our audience, and I'm willing to bet that none of our audience would have been watching PBS that night. So. It's going over well. I mean, I get a lot of anecdotal evidence. It's hard to measure the impact of a film. We can't really say that a piece of legislation passed. I mean, it's our goal. We would love to be able to say that. But I think most...
I'd love to be able to say that too, but it doesn't happen very often.
That's right.
I couldn't resist.
Well, we're all hopeful.
Timing is everything.
That's, it really comes down to, again, just reaching the people in the right place at the right time. And, the trick with Hampton Roads is Virginia is what's called a Dillon Rule state. Senator could probably explain it a little better than I can, but it essentially means that the municipalities, whatever powers they don't retain for themselves, the state has. There's no county level above these 17 municipalities. So they either have the power among them or they don't. And in Virginia State Assembly, you've got a lot of coal interests there. One thing you would see in the film, and I have copies of the film if anybody would like to come up and talk about doing a screening at some point. But Virginia, Hampton Roads is the largest coal exporting port on the East Coast. So the folks who represent Virginia from the Appalachian region, they may not care about sea level rise, but they're sort of coming around on, well, what's going to happen to Lambert's Point, which is the coal export facility. So again, putting it in terms that Appalachian delegation can get behind. And I think that's been, again, hard to measure, but what I'm hearing from folks that are using the film down there is that it has been an effective tool that they've been able to
Can we assume that you could make the same film or something close to it in Kittery and Portsmouth and in Newport, Rhode Island, and Jacksonville, and practically San Diego, similar kinds of issues?
I think so. I mean, maybe I'm just a little naively optimistic, but I think that there's a lot that unites us in terms of our values. And you can always show, at least in terms of economic impact, there's always an economic argument to be made. And our economic security, as you know, it's intertwined with our national security. So, I mean, I would start by asking the question, the reason why we took this tack is we look at where are the obstacles. I say center-right audience because it seems to be that's, if you can move that block, then we kind of score a goal on getting some progress here. And so, I don't know if, my sense in Maine, yes, swing state, I guess that's the conventional wisdom. So this would be a great place to tell that story. New Hampshire as well. California, I guess, I don't know, they seem to have drunk the Kool-Aid by now. But certainly Florida, I mean, it's amazing that so many Floridians still are not, have woken up to this yet.
One of the questions, I've got some questions that have already come in from the audience. One is, does the Pentagon budget already include money to reduce impacts of sea level rise and storm surge on military installations? Are there estimates of what the long-term cost may be to relocate and/or fortify our installations? I can give a partial answer to that. As far as I know, there's no comprehensive estimate of costs of relocation or fortification costs. However, I can say that in the National Defense Bill, which passed back in December, there were some references, and one of them is a direct order to the Department of Defense to prepare a report on the most vulnerable installation and the cost of mitigation. So as far as I know, it's not happening, but it should be happening now because that law passed last December to start that kind of analysis. Because again, in the case of the military installations, it's really just a question of cost. But I don't think I don't want to lose sight of the fact that we're really talking about a long-term conflict aggravation factor here, and that's what I think. Of all the effects of climate change, that's one of the ones that I think is that we have to worry about the most. And the general has already told us that it is part of their doctrine that they look at and consider in terms of how to prepare. But General, it seems to me that we've got these words from Dan Coates, the Director of National Intelligence, from the Quadrennial Review, but the question is, does the military policy making structure, does Secretary Mattis get this?
Well, I think Jim does. I think he's on record talking about the impact of climate change on our planning and on our operations. And I think that we have already begun the process. And I think one of the places that we've already begun the process is here in this area in Portsmouth Naval Shipyard. They've put in a microgrid in order to be more resilient to survive the tidal incursions. I know that other installations, the Army policy is to go to net zero on their Army installations. The Air Force has got a very robust program to put solar panels in order to generate electricity for their housing areas. The Marine Corps is trying to steal from anybody they can to do similar kinds of operations. The issue is that a lot of these initiatives depend on the installation commander and what's going on. It's good to hear that that's in there so that there can be a more centralized and you can't manage anything without measuring it. And so with what you're doing there is providing I think a very good way to improve how we're following this and get it done.
Lisa, you want to, how do you want to proceed at this point? Lisa's going to take over the moderator role. You're about to go to sound. Yeah.
So I had a couple more questions, and I'm going to, just invite any of you to talk. So we're all talking about how to communicate about climate change, and frankly, it's one of the number one things that NRCM is pondering every day in our meetings, and as we try to advocate for these issues, is how do you talk about this in a way that people will come along with you. And so I just wonder, what have each of you learned? Now, we heard from Roger, don't start out talking about climate change if you're trying to get the center right. Certainly don't talk about Al Gore and polar bears, but I'm just wondering, for all of you with the very different audiences that you're talking to, how do you talk about climate change in a way that resonates?
Well, let me share. It was very interesting to me. I went to many of the hearings for the nominees to the cabinet. I like to go to hearings even if I'm not on the committee. And the one thing I've learned from doing that is that the chairs that the senators have behind that big desk are much more comfortable than the chairs in the audience. That's a for sure. But I noticed, and I went to Scott Pruitt's, I went to Rex Tillerson's, Mike Pompeo, I can't think of Ryan Zinke, Secretary Perry, and it was really interesting because the question always came up, what do you think about climate change? And the answer was the same. We believe, I mean, it was a mantra. It was, we believe that the climate is changing, it's having significant effects, and people may have something to do with it, but we don't know to what extent. That was the standard answer. And some of you rolled your eyes at that. However, that's progress from it's not happening. And so, we've now gotten to the point where at least there is some consensus that something serious is going on and that is something we have to think about and deal with. Then the question becomes, okay, what do we do? And so I think, Lisa, that's progress, and I think it probably is based upon the fact that people can no longer deny what they see. The old country music, are you going to believe me or your own lying eyes? And people are seeing these things happening, and that's having an effect.
Yeah. General, you're traveling around the country. What do you think?
I thought that was the Eagles with lying eyes. Well, I live in Redlandia, and so I have an opportunity to interact on a daily basis, and I think one of the instructional events that I have is periodically I'll go in with a group of farmers and an agronomist and others related to agriculture. And we'll talk about, hey, how's things going, boy? And they said, hey, the growing season's getting 2 weeks longer. And we're getting a lot of additional stress on our conservation measures because the amount of rain that comes down at once is more than we've had before. And we need to get that DeKalb Seed Company to produce some more seeds that are not only drought tolerant, but moisture tolerant. And so as you talk around through this, and you can see with these eyes what is happening, then you're starting to see the change. But right now, it's mostly with those who have the opportunity to see up close and personal what the impacts are. But as the senator says, that's an improvement.
Roger?
Yes, thank you, Lisa. Sorry. So, I already talked about my experiences with that. I think there's some good news here, which is that you can really put this into dollars now. The cost of renewable energy is coming down. And, there's some really important decisions that we're seeing around the country. Our new project's looking at the future of the electric grid and how we transform it. We just saw in Arizona, the body that regulates the utilities industry there voted against a new gas plant. And it's a five-person Republican official commission. They're all Republicans. They're all proud conservatives, they would say so. And they just looked at the spreadsheet. It was just a question of numbers. It was too expensive compared with renewables. And I think we just saw a similar decision from the FERC do something similar. Secretary Perry had proposed some sort of fossil fuel-based plant. And they said, no, we can't. Our mandate is to go with the most cost-effective option here. And so I think it's heartening. I mean, it makes it easier for us to have this conversation, because if we just go straight to the dollars, then we're halfway there.
All right, so now I'm going to get just a little bit edgier because I can. And because it's NRCM, right? So public opinion polls show that a high percentage of Americans are concerned about climate change. Yet, we have a U.S. Congress and administration filled with officials who are rejecting science. They may not reject that climate change is real, but they're certainly rejecting any notion that it has anything to do with us. So what will it take to get us on a path of serious action in Congress? Senator, why don't you start?
How did I know? My experience with public policy is that you argue, you put forth your policy, you do it again, you do it again, you do it again. It takes years, years and years, and then suddenly something happens. There's a tipping point, and it just happens. And it's hard to describe, it's hard to explain. I think, and I don't know whether it will take an event, a huge flood, a huge storm event, although we've already had several of those. But I've seen it already starting to happen. There was a moment, it was sort of humorous, in the Armed Services Committee. And remember I mentioned there was a provision in the bill this year that talked about the significance of climate change as a national security issue. Well, Jim Inhofe is on our committee. Those of you who aren't familiar with him, he's one of the most conservative Republican senators and has become sort of famous as an opponent of climate change. He acquiesced in the acceptance of that amendment. It was unanimous in the committee. And this is a committee that includes Ted Cruz and Jim Inhofe and some pretty conservative people. So I think there is a kind of turning point. When that will, the other piece is that the economics are changing. And Roger suggested this. Remember my graph that I had of sea level? You could turn that graph upside down, and that would be the graph of the cost of solar power. It's gone from $70 a watt to about $1.30 in the last 25 or 30 years, from $70 to $1.30, $1.50. That's a huge change that really changes the discussion. Then it's no longer, I'm doing this because I want to be a good guy, I'm doing this because it makes sense. And some of the lowest power sales agreements in the country in recent years have been for solar and wind plants, particularly out west. So the combination of the economics of the alternatives and the growing realization that just cannot be denied, I think we're going to reach a tipping point, and I can't tell you whether it's this year, next year, 4 years from now, but I'm optimistic. I think there is a moment coming when people are going to say, wait a minute, we've got to do something about this. And you know, the administration clearly doesn't take this issue very seriously, but I don't think that necessarily is going to stop the momentum of the idea.
Okay. General?
Go ahead.
You can't be an advocate and not be an optimist. That's Lisa Pullman speaking.
And I drew my graph here and then turned it upside down to be sure it would really work. I wasn't sure.
Go ahead, General.
You know, sometimes you just keep pushing and pushing, and then it happens. You know, my philosophy has always been is figure out what the right thing is and keep doing it. We always hope it'll be sooner rather than later, but that's you know, left up to God and something else. So our job is to do the best we can to push the ball down the field, and that's my approach to it. I don't know when it's going to happen. It'll happen, and until it does, I'll keep pushing.
Go ahead, Roger.
Yeah, I mean, picking back up on the energy equation, I mean, storage is the next big item here. When we see, I think there's going to be a graph that we'll have up, I hope pretty soon. I mean, it's coming, where we see the price of storage come down. And again, our new project is, you know, we're not just looking at the transformation of the grid. We start with an agenda and then thinking about how do we reach the audiences that we're trying to reach, what's the path of least resistance. We know that if we can't put together a grid transformation policy that both the auto industry and the utilities industry can get behind, then we're not going to have an electric vehicle economy as quickly as we can. And again, that addresses the problems that, or addresses the causes of climate change without having to talk about climate change. You know, you'll see Google and Waymo and Tesla, you know, they're getting in on the storage business. People, if they keep getting these policies, the utilities companies are rescinding net metering programs, people are going to get upset and they're going to get off the grid. And then what happens to their business model? So I think, you know, that is something that we can do, even if we're dismayed by the political situation. I mean, you can vote with your dollars. And I think that is a big deal, and that's probably the most immediate power that we have.
So we're in the midst today of a conversation about climate change impacts and national security threats. We're not in the habit in the US of thinking globally, it seems to me, normally. And yet, we have a president who's announced that he'll pull us out of the US, pull the US out of the Paris Climate Agreement. That would leave us the only nation in the world not participating in the accord, especially now that Syria has even joined. I'm very moved by the afternoon panel when our friends who originated in Africa talked about how, yeah, solar and wind would be great. We don't have the resources in Africa to do solar and wind. Fair enough. I don't know what the price would have to come down to make that viable. So what is the US's responsibility to the rest of the world on this issue that actually has global implications? And how are we going to push that and communicate about that? What are we learning in our conversation today? What are you learning as you go around the country? Any one of you. Maybe the general should start on this.
I hate not being the senior guy at the table.
I refuse to raise your relative youth and inexperience as an issue.
You know, one of the things that I've had the opportunity to do is talk with international development folks. They're doing a great job under some pretty tough situations, but they're forging ahead. And there's a lot of public-private efforts that are out there right now. And one of the things that I've been involved with was one where in Africa they were working with a country to establish a poultry industry by helping create a mill to make the feed, to advise on the nutrition for chickens, and to do stuff like that. You know, those are areas that we need to exploit a little bit more, and maybe the energy area, you know, with our expertise and renewables is something that we can work in that area. We're going to need money. One of the ways to do that is to have people like the senator and others that are able to do it in a harsh environment, is to get the funding to do stuff like that. We know that the cell phone network over there, they skip the landlines in a lot of areas, and they've gone directly to the cell phone. Maybe this is another area that we could be successful in.
The withdrawal from the Paris Agreement was a grave mistake. It was a grave mistake because this is a uniquely global problem. Portland, Maine can't solve it. Maine can't solve it. New England can't solve it. The United States can't solve it. The movement of CO2 doesn't respect borders. And so the only way we're going to deal with it is through a worldwide effort. And the problem is if we absent ourselves from the table, and by the way, we have something like 5% of the world's population and use something like 25 or 30% of the world's energy. That's an unsustainable share because we can't tell India, I'm sorry, you can't air condition, or the people of China, I'm sorry, you can't have a second car. So it's going to take a global solution, and what bothered me about that decision was it was not, the Paris Climate Accord was not a binding treaty in the sense of imposing dollars and cents burdens. It was an aspirational treaty that did include the whole world, literally. And so I don't think it's the end of the story by any means. I think other countries are going to continue to work on it. But basically, we abdicated an area of leadership on an important issue that's, you know, as we've been talking about earlier today, is going to be important to us. This isn't an abstract issue. My friend Bill Mook, who grows oysters up in Damariscotta, you go to a fancy restaurant in New York, you see Damariscotta River oysters. He now has to incubate his oysters in tanks on the shore because the water in the Damariscotta River is too acidic for the tiny oysters to form their shells. So he incubates them on the shore until they get a certain size in a tank and then moves them out into the river. That's a practical business-related expense that's caused by climate change, and particularly ocean acidification, which is another byproduct of what's going on. So for us to sort of say, well, you know, we're not going to participate in a worldwide solution, I think is, as I said, a grave mistake.
I think if only Obama had been against the Paris Treaty, then Trump would have been for the Paris Treaty. It's just that simple. I mean, it's tribal, right? But you know, I just think you know, I'm the far from the national security expert here up on the stage, but I just think common sense would tell you that when you upset your friends, they're less likely to come help you later when you need them. And in this world that things travel so quickly, and goods and information, I mean, we need our friends, and we need to, I mean, we have so many military bases all around the world. I wouldn't be surprised if somehow those became less accessible because we're upsetting our allies. I guess, again, the market is probably, I mean, I'm not an evangelist for the free market. I admit to being a proud progressive. I believe in a good, strong government that takes care of its citizens. But I think that the demand here is really going to drive it. And when you see China stepping up with electric vehicles and saying to Volvo and Ford and all the others, you're not selling gas-powered cars in our country anymore. And in that, of course, with the increased demand that we have here. I mean, I don't know, Senator, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. I mean, it's very disheartening to hear the decision the other day about rolling back the auto emissions standards. It doesn't seem, though, that the electric vehicle market is going to stop. It seems like that momentum is on its way. So, no, I take heart at knowing that people have common sense and they're moving in the right direction.
Did you want to comment on the car thing?
Well,
we'd love you to.
I think electrification of vehicles is inevitable. It's just a question of time. I have a little Nissan Leaf myself. I bought it at Lee Auto in Topsom, but because it only gets 80 miles to a charge, I had to truck it to Washington. It would have been like going across the country in a covered wagon. I'd get to Worcester and I'd have to charge, and then I'd get. But it's a perfect car to use in a city. I charge it literally once a week, and it's convenient. It does everything you want an automobile to do. It doesn't make any noise, and what I like most about it is there's a little. Everybody, you have this little sign up in the little sticker in the left-hand corner of your windshield that tells you about your service. Mine says rotate tires every 16,000 miles. That's it. There's nothing else to do to it. I think for convenience, and again, I don't think it's going to be because of altruism. I think it's going to be because this is a practical, sensible way to go, and we're going to see more and more charging stations, and people are going to be able to plug in at night as they do. I can tell you, as a little survey, there's a row of charging stations in the Washington National Airport. There are about 8 or 9 of them. And I've been using them for a year or so now, and I find more and more they're full up. When I get there, I can't get a space. So I think that's an indication. And by the way, they're full up with big, expensive Teslas, not with my little Nissan Leaf. But I think that's an indication that this is going to continue and grow. And there are going to be limitations. This isn't, the newer Nissan Leafs, I think, get 120 miles. You can pay extra and get 200 miles. We're getting close to and the new chargers, they're just, I'm telling you lots of things you probably don't want to know, but to charge an electric car out of your AC, your regular plug, takes about 12 hours. To do it with a dryer plug takes about 5 hours. They now have chargers called superchargers where you can charge your car in a half hour. And you're going to see those at grocery stores and malls and places. So you plug in, shop, fully charge your car, and shop and come out, and you're ready to go for a week. I think that is the direction that we're going in. Again, in part because of federal support, but also because that's just where the economy's going. I think it's Volvo that says they're not making any more internal combustion engine cars and after 2021 or something like that. I think it's economics are gonna deal with it.
Roger, I have one audience question just for you, which is, are you working on any new films?
Yes, so our new project is called Current Revolution, and it's trying to put together, again, what I had mentioned as a strategic narrative that all players can really get behind. This idea that, again, the auto industry and the utilities industry, if they're not on the same page, then they're going to fight it. We know how that happens, and of course their lobbyists will drag it out, and they'll have their friends on Capitol Hill, not the senator, of course, they'll drag it out. But it is, again, it's designed with the idea that we have to identify first what is the policy outcome, or what is the cultural change, or the behavioral change that we seek. And then once we identify that, and we actually consult with people that know this stuff. So we consult with American Security Project and all kinds of groups that are working this stuff from a policy angle. And then once we're clear on what the policy objectives should be, then we figure out, okay, who are the audiences that need to hear it. It's not preaching to the choir. And who are the best messengers for that audience. And then how are we going to tell that story, never losing sight of that policy objective that we have.
That's great.
Lisa, there's a
Please.
national security question here, and it's kind of an interesting one. Traditionally, our electric grid has been set up the same way for about 120 years. Large generating plant, wires, and house. That's the model. The problem is that a centralized system like that is vulnerable to attack. If you knock out that large generating plant or knock out some of the switchgear in between, you knock out thousands or hundreds of thousands of houses. If you have a decentralized grid where each house is making its own electricity, or there are microgrids where there's a neighborhood that can have its own generation, a solar farm or some other, then if you think about it, that's a more secure setting from a national security point of view, because it's much harder to take down the whole grid. And believe me, the grid is under threat. It is a significant target, and it's one of the things that I worry a great deal about. And one of the ways to mitigate that risk is by having decentralized electrical generation at the home or at the neighborhood level, and that can be done. And Roger's right. One of the keys to this is storage. And if when batteries get cheaper, it's going to change everything, because then people can generate their own electricity, have their own backup, and that, I think that's going to be part of our energy future. But I just wanted to make a note of that national security aspect of this, because the grid right now is a prime target, and it's a deep concern.
Sure.
One quick point to that. And that's what makes utilities executives really nervous, because when everybody starts generating their own power in their home, how are the utilities going to make money? And they're trying to figure that out. They're not going to make it by building more nuclear plants and more gas plants. We've already seen that that's not a feasible model for them. So they have to think quickly how they're going to be able to make money off of batteries and this new energy platform that we're putting out there. And they better hurry up. And one thing we try to do is not demonize them and consider them to, it's easy to say, oh, evil big corporation. But you need to show them a sort of a path to a brighter future for themselves, and that's just what we think a good story can do for them.
So I would like to wrap up by having each of you say whatever final remarks you'd like to say, parting shots, whatever it is you'd like to say, and perhaps we'll start with the youngest member of the panel and work to the left.
Well, I would just say it's an honor to be here. It's especially an honor to sit with these two gentlemen here. And also it's very heartening for me to see that the work that I do in terms of storytelling is valued. I go to conferences. I don't really go to so many film festivals. I mean, yes, I like to go to them. I like when my film is accepted, and I certainly want to win the award. But it often is preaching to the choir. And so what I hear at a lot of conferences now is, well, we have a lot of science, we have a lot of great data, we know what needs to be done, but we need to do a better job at telling our story. And I think all of us, no matter what field we work in, and no matter what our political views are, we can all think about that a little more deeply. And before we just get into heated political battles and demonize people, think about where people are, where to meet them, where are they coming from. I kind of have in my mind this fictional Uncle Frank, who's the irascible uncle at Thanksgiving dinner, that you don't want to talk about climate change with. But if Uncle Frank is an outdoorsman, you can start there. Hey, Uncle Frank, have you seen, as the general was saying, when he's talking to other farmers about the growing season, start there. So meet people where they are.
Thanks.
Our national power, I think, is made up of three legs to the stool. One is national resources, one is national performance, and the third one is national military. National resources are not just the physical ones, but it's also the spirit of the people and the willingness to work together toward common challenges and objectives. Performance is based on our ability to have a functioning government and a civil society that can support each other and achieve objectives. The last element of national power we should ever want to employ is our military power. In many cases, when we do that, it's a result of our failure in other areas. So I encourage all of you to think about those that are overseas, about the families. You know, my lovely wife is over here. We were in for 36 years, as I've said. She moved us 25 times. She's the real hero of the Castellaw team. And that's how we ought to approach the nation and what we have to achieve. Thank you all very much.
Listening to the general talk makes me feel like I'm back down there with the Tennessee caucus. And I have to tell a funny story. Roger mentioned about how mayors tend to be more practical and less partisan. Governors also tend to be that way. And there are 11 of us in the Senate. There are 11 former governors, and so we formed our own little group, Former Governors Caucus. And I went up to Mitch McConnell and told him about it, and I said, Mitch, we're forming a Former Governors Caucus, and you know we're going to try to work together, nonpartisan, get some things done. And he said, well, Angus, I got to tell you, I found if you have a former governor who's now a senator, and you ask them which job they like better, if they say senator, you know they'll lie to you about other things. That's an absolutely true story. Lisa, first, thank you for putting this together. I think of two things, and Roger's helped me on this tonight. I think number one is listening. We got to listen to each other a little bit better. We got to listen to those people who are skeptical, who aren't sure, who feel that their livelihoods are in danger, that their lives are going to be changed. And I think we all tend to get our positions and get locked in, and we tend to be a little less tolerant. And I think I like the phrase eloquent listening. I think we have to listen better and understand why it is people don't see things as we believe, as clearly as we believe that they are. I think that's number one. And number two, we have to realize that change is really hard. A friend of mine once said, everybody's for progress, nobody's for change. And I really think there's something to that. And resistance to change is wired into us. It's human nature. It's a conservative tendency, if you will. And the most profound observation on change that I have ever encountered was from Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln once said that he never had a political thought that didn't derive from the Declaration of Independence. And I never had a political thought that didn't derive from Abraham Lincoln. And in 1862, on December 2nd, Lincoln went to the Congress because the Civil War was then in its height, or its depth, if you will. And the Congress was still being the Congress. It was still dealing with this as a kind of political issue, arguing, debating, not being responsive to the times. And Lincoln was very frustrated. He was trying to sort of shake them out of this politics as usual mentality. And at the end of his speech that day, he used some words that, to me, is the most profound observation about change and how to deal with it that I've ever encountered. And here's what Abraham Lincoln said. The dogmas of the quiet past are inadequate to the stormy present. The occasion is piled high with difficulty, and therefore we must rise with the occasion. As our case is new, so we must think anew and act anew. We must disenthrall ourselves and then we shall save our country. That's the key line. We must disenthrall ourselves, think in new and different ways, and then we shall save our country. Thanks, Lisa.
Thank you, sir. It was an honor.
Let me just give a final thanks to the panel. Also thanks to Pete Dittesheim, Emmy Taberge, and Kristen Jackson, who did your women's and men's work to put this together. All of you, thank you so much. Have a good evening.